Well, Mr. Chairman, I've said this before when I've had such an introduction. It sounds very good, but really we've got to wait and see what the speaker has to say as to whether at the end of the talk, whether all this introduction is really worth it. Now, apparitions. I've entitled this talk, Apparitions, Fact or Fiction. And I've no doubt that it poses a question. And I've no doubt that you're going to ask me at the end, give you the answer. And after something like 100 years of organized psychical research, and many thousands of years of human experience of having seen apparitions, having heard ghosts, having experienced shades in their many different forms, I don't think we're in any position today to give the answer any more than they were when they saw them 1,000 years ago. The only thing that I think one can say when one is asking the question fact or fiction is that human experience and human testimony over the years would lead one to believe that certainly people are seeing something. As for cause, this I think is still an open question. We know, of course, that the apparition has probably been used by most people and more people as evidence for survival than perhaps any other phenomena that we are interested in this society. Indeed, it started this society on its trek of investigation many, many years ago, probably with a census of hallucinations. Admittedly, prior to that, people were interested in the phenomena of table turning. But I don't think there's any doubt whatever that one of the things that has mystified the psychical researcher before the days of statistical analysis, which we're all embroiled in now, is what is a ghost, where does it come from, what does it mean, is it a fact or is it fiction? Well, I'm going to discuss the subject generally tonight, and I'm going to give you one or two cases that I've looked into and that the University Society has looked into, and which I think in their individual instances represent the contradictions which we face in this field when we're looking at apparitions or when we're looking at anything else. Most of you know the theories that are being put forward by Gurney and by Myers, and I think most of you know this very good book by Tyrrell. I would thoroughly recommend Tyrrell's book. I myself have had aspirations to write a book on apparitions for a number of years, but whenever I read Tyrrell's book, those aspirations become a little bit dimmer, because I think it is a classic. I think he has analyzed many, many cases and has divided them up into the kind of fields which the psychic researcher should look at and should ponder upon. What are we to make of a ghost, or a shade, or an apparition? Use whatever term you like. They all mean the same thing. What is this image of a human being that somebody sees out of the corner of their eye, or that conveys some message from the dead, from a departed person, or in other fields experimentally can be made to appear in another room when you know that the living person, which that apparition is a double, is sitting somewhere else? These are the contradictions. What we do know for a fact is that human beings, living human beings, do see apparitions not only of the dead, but another contradiction, of the living. In fact, I don't think it's widely known that there have probably been more reported cases of apparitions of the living in some fields and under some circumstances than there have been of the dead. The common denominator, of course, is the experience of the percipient. And whilst there are many people who favor that an apparition is indeed a visitation from the next world, I think a lot of people are more inclined today to think that an apparition is probably the creation of the percipient. Whichever it is a challenge. And whatever form the apparition appears, under whatever circumstances it appears, it seems to be different. Now, Tyrrell says in his book, and I think many of us who have hunted ghosts and investigated the subject and been puzzled by it, do note is that you never get a perfect apparition in a full, complete imitation of a normal living human being. It either can be seen by one person and heard by another, and not seen by that person. It can sometimes be seen to cast a shadow, sometimes it casts no shadow at all. It has been observed by people to come through locked doors and a few seconds afterwards walk round the coffee table. Contradiction again. Most, I think, are seen in colour, but many are seen as black and white. You can, at the same time, produce, and I have done this as a hypnotist, and I know other hypnotists who have done it, you can get hold of a subject and you can tell them that when you count up to 3 and they open their eyes, they will see the figure of Bill Smith in front of them, and Bill Smith isn't in the room at all. Now, why do I mention this particular aspect of experimental hypnosis when I'm talking about apparitions? Well, I should have thought that it's crystal clear that if you can hypnotize somebody when Mr. Smith is not in actual fact in the room, and you can hypnotize them and say, when you open your eyes, you will see Mr. Smith, that what in actual fact you are doing is creating, if you like, an apparition in front of their eyes. And it's interesting, when we examine this particular aspect, to note that if you do not reinforce the subject, and when I say reinforce, you say to the person, Mr. Smith will be standing in front of you when you open your eyes. If you don't reinforce it by suggesting after something like 30 seconds or 50 seconds what is wrong, and the mere fact you say what is wrong reinforces the person who's seeing it, the image stays there. If you don't reinforce it, it looks as if the image disappears in roughly between a minute and a minute and a half. Now, most people, when they see an apparition, of course, are not sitting or standing with a stopwatch in their hand. And it's only when we read a number of cases, of collective cases, for instance, or that there is some other reference to time, do we get an indication as to how long a person has seen an apparition, or how long an apparition has been parading around in front of them. There have been some cases of up to many hours. But I would suggest that possibly the average apparitional experience by a person may be geared to the kind of time that I was talking about when you hypnotize someone. And this, I should have thought, might again tie up and be an indication that perhaps an apparition is something produced by the percipient. These are my feelings. These are my guesses and my inclinations when I'm discussing what causes an apparition. But on the other hand, we have the complex nature of the apparitional appearance. Some of us know that many ghosts or shades will appear to someone under circumstances in which they are not expecting to see a ghost, and that ghost or apparition can convey something which they believe they do not know. How can a person who is creating a ghost in their mind obtain that kind of information at the same time as seeing an apparition? These are the contradictions. There are many contradictions, and they make the subject even more exciting and even more difficult, I think, to explain. I said earlier on, Mr. Chairman, that I don't think that we can give the answer to the question whether an apparition is a fact or whether it's fiction in a clear sense. We can say, I think, without hesitation, that many forms of apparition are experienced as single experiences with people under varying conditions and collectively. And when we get to the collective experience of an apparition by 1, 3, or 4 people, it becomes difficult to explain just exactly how those 4 or 5 people in their mind can generate exactly the same scene and produce it into what has been described as individual space, not physical space, how can they be coordinated? This again is one of the mysteries. I think the oldest case that I know of, and I haven't got full reference to it, but the oldest case that I've read of an apparition, is one of a report where Charles IX of Sweden, who accompanied by his chamberlain and state physician, witnessed the trial of the assassination of Gustav III, which occurred nearly 100 years after it. Now, apparitions, we normally tie up, other than those instances of crisis cases where they can be for 12 hours before death or 12 hours after death, we generally associate them with memories of the past or happenings of the past, because they are seen by people who recognize a deceased mother or a relative, or they recognize a brother that they know is a distant, in such instances as crisis cases. But most of them are connected with the past, and most of them would appear to be some form of memory. When we get to the kind of case that I've just quoted, or just mentioned, it is a ghost, if you like, of the future that is seen. And we're then getting into the field of precognition. And I know of very, very few instances where a person can say that they have seen a ghost of the future. And to me, this is very significant. It seems to me that it raises many interesting matters, which would be a sideline to discuss this evening, but let me just bring one small point out. If there is an absence, a very significant absence of people seeing apparitions of the future, then I would think that it possibly means that as man goes on in science and progresses, that he will never be able to go backwards in time. If he does go backwards in time, if in 100 years, for instance, the scientists of the day have managed to create some means by which they can come back, and listen to me, God forbid, but if they could come back and see us at the moment, then they should have done it. We should have experienced it up to now. They should have seen it 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 500 years ago. But there have been no clear cases, in my mind, of apparitions of the future. It may be that perhaps if we do get to that stage in science where we can travel back in time, that we can observe what has happened in the past, but that we cannot ourselves be physically present and be seen in the past. That's one small point. And I said, that is a digression, but an examination of apparitions and discussion of shades and how and why their cause and effect, must lead us to postulate whether or not the absence of ghosts of the future does indicate the kind of thing that I've just discussed. So it looks, Mr. Chairman, in my mind, that we are dealing with something that is in the mind of the percipient, and that is something that is contained or triggered off in the memory banks of the percipient or the percipients. For instance, I say to you now, the actual word now. Well, to us, we remember it, and I remember having said the word now, but in actual fact, we're all living in a series of time which is the present, and we are remembering the past, so that most of our daily experiences are geared to the memory of the past, even if it's the long past or an immediate past. And this, to me, again seems to be significant, that the ghost is geared to the past, that it's geared to a memory. I have heard some people daringly suggest that there is such a thing as hereditary memory. I know of no medic who would say that there's any evidence for this, whatever. And many of us in psychical research like to steer very safe, scientific, respectable lines. Now, I don't always think to steer very safe, respectable lines is going to advance us in our discussion or our investigation of any particular subject. I think one should be careful what one says. I think one should not make completely outrageous statements. But this is a field where, in many ways, anything goes. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps there might be something called inherited memory. I have no proof of it, none whatever. But it does seem to me that many apparitions could be explained in such a way. Not the crisis case known to someone, not Aunt Mary who died 3 years ago and who is seen by her cousin or her sister or her brother or some relation, but perhaps the traditional ghost, the ghost, the shade, the apparition that haunts a particular place. Perhaps this has some link with inherited memory. As I said earlier, Mr. Chairman, as we all know, as we examine this subject of psychical research and the various effects that we're interested in it, it's full of contradictions. I always describe it as like being in the bath when you're groping for the soap. And as the water gets more and more cloudy, so you think you've got the soap, but it slips out of your hand. There are many theories put forward that one would accept as clearly indicating that apparitions are the result of a hallucination. There are other cases which clearly show that an apparition or a ghost is something that has come back from the dead. But when you examine the individual cases, when you go through Myers, when you go through Gurney, when you read some of the instances contained in the book written by our chairman, or the investigations that have been carried out on apparitions that we have in the files of the SBR, one finds that there is no clear-cut explanation for this particular phenomenon. And let me go through just one or two cases that I've looked at. I won't take them in any particular order, but I think that if we examine them one against the other, we will see how the contradictions come out. I think I'll start by giving you an example as to how one shouldn't investigate a ghost. In 1953, myself and one or two friends were celebrating one of my friend's wife's birthday, and we didn't quite know how we would celebrate it, and somebody somewhere said they heard that on the 17th of March at the Ferryboat Inn, Holywell, which is in Huntingdonshire, a white lady was seen, and that a stone, or it's a square slab, stone square slab, in this on the floor of this very old pub, had been seen to move, and it was suggested that the lady was buried under the slab, and the story was further told that she pointed to the slab, the indication being that she wished to be removed from the slab, or underneath it. Well, we all went down to the inn that particular night, and the landlord was not there, but one or two locals were, and they knew exactly what we were doing when they saw us turn up a tray, a metal tray, and chalk the alphabet around the outer circle of it, and sit with our fingers on an upturned wine glass. And we got some extraordinary stuff from it. We got from the Ouija board meanderings of this glass that the lady was, that we had come to investigate, that her name was Juliet, and that her surname was Tuesley, and that she had hung herself from a tree at the end of the garden because she had been in love with a married man, one called Thomas Dole, and that Thomas Dole was a woodman, that he was a dweller, he chopped down trees, and that because she had been a suicide, she had been buried at the sign of the cross, which was the ford that crossed the river, and where this particular inn stood. And the date was given that she died in 1054, and that she was a Norman. It was all very interesting stuff. I'm sure it all came from our subconscious minds, because a thorough search of the history of the area interviews with people in the village afterwards, people who'd lived there all their life. Nobody had ever seen this apparition. Nobody had ever recorded it. In fact, I remember saying at the time, aha, well, the Normans came to England in 1066. What were you doing here in 1054? And I got the very cryptic answer back, we didn't all come over in one boatload, which is perfectly correct. But it was a very, very interesting case because there was absolutely, as far as we could see, no evidence of a Julius Tuesday. No recorded history or story about Thomas Dole. This came out from the Ouija board, and it came out from our subconscious minds. Well, next year came round, and this was 1953, this was first done. 1954, the landlord of this pub, who had not been there on that particular night, rang me up and said, would I like to come back and investigate this following year? And I said, in all honesty, I had no intention whatever, but if he wanted me to, yes, all right. And he said, well, I hope you don't mind if we invite a few friends round and we'll give you dinner after you've done your investigation. And it's one of the first cases I investigated, and it was a very, very good lesson in how not to investigate and how not to fall into that kind of trap. Because in the national dailies, about a fortnight or 10 days, fortnight afterwards, there were little snippets saying, landlord obtains late license for ghosts. Investigators will find that they have dinner laid on at 12, and all this kind of thing. And I still took a team of some 8 or 9 people down to this particular alleged haunted house, and we sat in the corner and we wished to goodness that the ground would open up or that we would disappear into the blue as ghosts, because we had drunken Americans wandering through with bottles of whiskey saying, I've got we've got our spirit, have you found yours? And it's a perfect example of how not to investigate a haunted house. It has also turned out to be a case which the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, in their supplement some 6 or 7 years ago, I think, something of that order, I found the supplement, funnily enough, only the other evening, has classified this particular inn as the 5th most haunted house in England. Now, how they've arrived at this, I do not know, because we have looked into this case in very great depth, and we can find absolutely no evidence whatever that there has ever been seen by the locals or recorded a lady dressed in white pointing at a stone in the pub as if she wished to be removed from it. And Julius Tuesday, when you start looking into that, you'll find that the minds of the people who were sitting around the Ouija board and investigating the thing were going through some peculiar melodramas, I think, because the name Juliet doesn't appear in 1054 anywhere. It comes in somewhere around about 1650. And Tuesday is not a Norman name, it is a Saxon name. Zoll has Thomas Zoll, the married man with which she was in love with, is of more interest, because if you trace that back, you find that it's a corruption of the very old French. I think it's something of that nature. And when literally translated, it means dweller by a tree stump. So that somebody got something right in that particular investigation, but where they got it from, I don't know. But to me, it's a perfect example of a case that has come out of the subconscious minds of the investigators. And it is now, as I said, quoted by a very respectable newspaper, and its supplement as the 5th most haunted house in England. A case which I don't think warrants too much further investigation. There's another interesting case that I looked at Histon, which is just outside Cambridge. In fact, it's the village in which I was born. And there's a very old house dated about 1484 called the Old House, which has had much more grounds round it in its earlier times, and they've been cut back and cut back and cut back. It has a sawmill at the back of it, it has some shops one end, it has a pub not very far the other side, and the road runs down the fourth side of the ground. And I was rung up by Colonel Lovelace about 2 years before the period that I'm going to talk about. And he said, I understand you're interested in psychic research and ghosts, and I'd like to talk to you about it, if I may, because although you'll think I'm silly, and I think I'm a bit silly, I have just seen a ghost. Well, eventually I went round and I had a word with him. And it was on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. He was doing some plastering of the replastering under the window and kneeling down with the window here, and the door was something of the order of about 10 or 12 feet in that direction. And he suddenly found himself looking at the door. I remember him saying, I was plastering intently because the plaster wouldn't stick where I was putting it. And all my concentration was on the plaster. And suddenly I found myself forced to look at the door. And silhouetted, not silhouetted, in the door, in full colour, but only up to there, was the smiling figure of a Cromwellian soldier with a large brown floppy hat, a belt, the ruff at the arms, but nothing from the waist down. And this apparition smiled at Colonel Lovelace and then gradually faded away. He saw this again, I think about 3 weeks afterwards, again on a Sunday morning at about the same time. And he didn't want to tell his wife because his wife, she thought that was a person who didn't really believe in this kind of thing, and in any case she might be upset. But the funny thing about it was that she, feeling the same thing about her husband, had seen the figure of a woman in black passing down the long corridor towards the kitchen on a number of occasions, and she had been quite secretive about this. She didn't ring me up and tell me about this, but she told me about it afterwards when we all got together and discussed it. Also, when they were both sleeping or lying in bed, after they had exchanged these notes and they knew that one had seen a ghost and the other had seen a ghost, they used to hear the latch of a wooden door which shut the panelled-in staircase up to the next floor. They used to hear the latch click, quite distinctive. In fact, they did tests, and I heard this click. So you could hear it very clearly from their bedroom. And they would come down in the morning and they would find the door ajar. Now, the door was so constructed, the hinges were so fixed to the wall, that the door would automatically close unless it was pushed over more than, I think it was about 40 degrees. I'm tempted to say 45. I think it's between 45 and 40 degrees. So that something was pushing this door open. Now, this is an apparition, but it's the kind of drama that one finds that builds up in cases where houses are haunted. Colonel Lovelace, some 6 or 7 months after this, died, and I think he died of a brain tumour. Whether this is relevant or not, I don't know. If he had a brain tumour and it was in some way making him see things, his wife didn't have one. She had seen things. And I don't think because he had seen things, she had listened to him and started seeing things herself. Because I said they both kept it from each other, so they didn't want to worry each other. But a Mrs. Dale, and I have written this up, I haven't published it, but I call it Mrs. Dale's Diary. Mrs. Dale and her husband, a son and a daughter, moved into the house, something of the order of about, I think, 7 or 8 months afterwards. And of course, Mrs. Lovelace, in selling the house, had not advertised it as haunted. I mean, you and I might be interested in buying a haunted house, but the average person isn't. So that as far as we can see, there was no communication whatever between the Lovelaces and the new owners. In fact, Mrs. Lovelace did assure me that she told nobody about this because she didn't particularly want to put people off buying a house. She wanted to sell it. And lo and behold, when the Dales move in, Mrs. Dale has a psychic diary all ready for events, which to me seems rather strange if she, as she said, and Mrs. Lovelace said, nothing had been communicated to them about the house having been haunted. But it's better than Borley ever was, if you even believe Borley. And I have doubts about that, although that might cause a certain amount of rumpus, I suppose, if we went into that one. But to précis it, the house it's been exorcised and nothing now happens in it. But at the time, over a period of 3 years, they had 8 different apparitions seen by 12 different people, in combinations of single observations, in one instance where 4 people saw a particular apparition at once, and on a number of occasions when husband and wife, husband and daughter, very sceptical son and mother saw something in the way of an apparition, either standing at the gate or at the door or peering through a window, or in one particular case very well authenticated by 3 particular people, a previous owner of the house, a Reverend Brown, was seen walking around in the garden outside. Now, this particular case has just about everything in it that you could think of. As I say, in many ways it's better than Borley. There's something in the order of 26 different auditory and physical effects that have been reported in this house by not only the family but visitors. And yet suddenly, for some unknown reason, it stops. It's exorcised. And I think that it raises the problem which all exorcisms raise, so whether or not the manifestation is being stopped, or whether the percipient who is observing it is being stopped by a belief that exorcism of some form will get rid of what they are seeing. Well, that kind of argument, Mr. Chairman, is all right, surely, if we're dealing with a single person. But as I said, 8 different apparitions in this house were seen by 12 different people, and not just on single occasions. How is it that an exorcism can stop all those 4? But then you see, when we're dealing with apparitions, we might reverse the thing and say, how, in the first place, can 9 people, or 12 people, or 4 people all see the same ghost at the same time? Again, we get the contradictions which these various cases raise. Did these effects that in the house that I'm talking about, did they come from the past? Were they created by the percipients? Now, the case is far too long and too detailed, I think, to examine at length here, but it is a case which in itself contains goodness knows what contradictions. It also has the other particularly interesting aspects of investigating apparitions, and deals with the subject itself, and that is photography. If you look through the Society's files under the heading of photographs of ghosts, you'll find that we are exceedingly thin. There's very, very little. And yet if we read psychic news, of course, there are people taking photographs of ghosts all over the place. Now, if a ghost is a physical effect, if an apparition is a physical effect, then it should, I should have thought, been capable of being photographed. Indeed, one would expect that if a person saw an apparition by their normal means of perception, it means that light is being reflected from a moving body or a standing body, just the same as light is being reflected from you and I. We cannot see each other unless light is visible. And yet if you get a camera out and you try and photograph a ghost, you'll generally find that there's nothing there. There are a number of cases, I must admit, that I've had drawn to my attention, which appear to be very, very peculiar results on a photograph, and they do suggest that perhaps when you examine the witnesses who swear that there was nothing standing at that particular point when they took the photograph, you've got that evidence, you find that there is something on the film. I'm going to suggest in a minute that perhaps the other subject that many of us are interested in, psychokinesis or PK, may in some ways be connected with an apparition. It would have to be, I think, if you argue that an apparition is normally the product of somebody's mind, the percipient, and you take a camera, and there is actually nothing in front of that person when they're seeing it, as I mentioned in the hypnotized percipient case, and yet you take a photograph and there's something appears on the actual film itself. It seems to me that the apparition in that case is probably being PK'd by the mind. I can't see how, if an apparition is actually a physical thing, and you take a photograph and there's nothing there, that it is a physical thing. Or the other way round, if somebody takes a photograph of an apparition, or takes a photograph of an area where there's no apparition, and one comes out. Mrs. Hayward gave me a photograph a number of years ago, which is a very interesting one, and it still puzzles me. I did return it to her. It came from the secretary of a very distinguished politician who is no longer with us, and she did at the time ask me never to mention the names, but if I mentioned it, you would know him for the bulldog he was. The secretary went out for a car ride in Surrey, and they stopped by the side of the road, having travelled some distance, to have some food. And they sat on a little hillock, and a photograph was taken of this group of 5 people sitting down with the cameraman would have been the 5th. So the group is of 5 people. It's an early colour photograph. We've examined this, had this particular photograph examined by the laboratory, and they can find nothing wrong with it. They couldn't find anything wrong with it at the time. They still, I think if they looked at it again, they wouldn't find anything wrong with it. It's an extraordinary composite picture, because here's the group sitting on this little hillock. And over down here in the grass, and you can see that if you look at it under a microscope or magnifying glass, you can see the figures are, let's say they're that high. The grass is growing halfway up the figures, so that the grass is superimposed on these figures. They are indeed small figures. And it looks something like down this side, rather like the Boston Tea Party, either that or a number of people who've been to a fancy dress ball, because there's a Red Indian, there's somebody who looks as if they're dressed up in some form of medieval attire, and various other bits of equipment of that nature, which make it a very interesting picture, but very difficult to explain. And on this side, it's appearing down in a row of 6.5, and I stress the half, is what appears to be a number of nuns or priests. I can't see what sex they are. They have the cassock over their head, walking like this. And I say half because one of them is only half. And it's not this half, it's that half. It's most peculiar. Now, at the time, nobody saw this. None of the group, the photographer didn't see it. The group who was sitting around there didn't see it. And it was only when the photograph was taken that these apparitions, I don't know, were seen. And the photograph in this particular case has been examined very, very carefully by people who know their subject inside out, where photography is concerned. And they say that it is not a double exposure, which many photographs of ghosts are, that the film, the light response of the colour is perfectly in order, and the shadows cast by these figures are also in order. So here again, we have a group, if you like, of apparitions that are not seen by the human eye, but are apparently captured by a camera, another contradiction. And so we go on. The whole of the field of apparitions is a contradiction. And when we ask the question, as I have asked the question or posed the question, fact or fiction, it is extremely difficult to give an answer, I think, on the evidence or on the conflicting evidence. that we have. As I said earlier, Mr. Chairman, I think the only thing that is fact is that human beings have had the experience of seeing apparitions, and that they have explained in many very difficult and inexplicable ways. Now, I mustn't go on too long, and I must come to some form of conclusion. But I would like to mention one or two other cases, because I think we've all read many of the traditional cases, and they've been printed time and time again, and there are little snippets that are of interest. And this one is a case that I know very, very well. I know the little girl concerned, I know the archaeologist involved, and I know the area very well. And it's an experience by a child at the age of 7. We have, just outside Cambridge, a Neolithic hill fort called Wandlebury. And it's an area which lots of people like to go and walk, because there's plenty of trees, and it's very secluded and very pleasant. And quite often groups of school children are taken to run around and walk around in the area. And on this particular day, a group from a school just outside Cambridge, small children, had been taken by one of the teachers to walk around the area. And this little girl had a habit of wandering off on her own, not a great deal, not to an alarm extent, but she didn't like to play with the rest of the boys and girls. There's nothing wrong with her psychologically, perfectly sane and sensible child for her age. And she said that while she was playing, and the others were some distance away, she saw a figure of a man, and she described this man, and she said at times she could see through him. But the figure didn't frighten her because he was so extraordinarily friendly. And he talked to her and said that he had known this area for many years, and he was very pleased that she was enjoying the trees and the sunlight and the beauty of life. And from the description that this girl gave to an archaeologist who was doing a dig at that time in that area, it was a Roman soldier that she saw. And this child's description of the clothing was so good that the archaeologist could type the Roman soldier, his rank, and even, I think, down to the particular, whatever it was, squadron or whatever they called them in Roman days. And this, to me, is highly significant. It is an apparition. It's an apparition in many ways with a message, but a message of a scientific order, because here's a child of 7 who, we did look into this, she'd had very little instruction in the way of, in school, on Roman dress. She hadn't seen anything in the way of Roman television plays. It was thoroughly investigated, and to me this is, if you like, not fiction, but an instance of fact. And it's the kind of case, although it's small, it's not very, very dramatic, it hasn't got a great deal of content in it. To me, it's a piece of evidence, because it comes from a child, and because of the accuracy of this child's description of the particular clothing that the Roman soldier was wearing. These are the kinds of cases which I think are of interest. Whether they tell us a great deal about the cause of apparitions, I don't know. Certainly the last one that I've mentioned, and many others that we have been lucky enough to read about or to know have been thoroughly investigated, have been authenticated as to their era. They do exist in the mind of the observer. They do carry a of cases which I think are of interest. Whether they tell us a great deal about the cause of apparitions, I don't know. Certainly the last one that I've mentioned, and many others that we have been lucky enough to read about or to know have been thoroughly investigated, have been authenticated as to their era. They do exist in the mind of the observer. They do carry a message. They do seem in some inexplicable way to convey information that the percipient did not know. But where they come from, still, I think, Mr. Chairman, remains a mystery. I have said that I favour the idea that it's in the percipient's mind. I have mentioned the subject of hereditary memory, but there is no proof that hereditary memory can be an explanation for it. I think there's no cast iron proof that an apparition is necessarily from the dead. I think we are still faced with a great deal more research and a great deal more information required before we can come to any conclusion whether or not an apparition is in the other sense fact or fiction. And I think I've spoken for nearly an hour. I haven't covered quite a number of points. I haven't covered the element of time, which to me in some way is, I think, a very, very important aspect of apparitions. And I haven't really gone into the aspects of hallucinations. But I think I've covered several points, and it might be best if I were to sit down and we were to discuss the subject and answer any questions or raise any points that I think people may wish to delve into.
Thank you.